At the beginning of the pandemic, I was convinced that everyone would be pulling together to try and find as many solutions as they could to save lives. And I think that in the early phase of the pandemic, we had never seen anything like it, where the scientific community gelled together, tried to find solutions, thought about innovation. That was the early days when, say, hydroxychloroquine was brought out and they were trying to find ways to prove if it was beneficial. And by the time of June 2020, we had dexamethasone. The recovery trial was again an example of scientists just doing everything they could to try and find an answer. But I think that after June 2020, and in my view, the transition point was not doing high dose steroids investigation immediately. I still come back to that and say that was the most unusual thing I'd ever seen after you'd found a drug that worked. But let's put that back. But there are two things that happened around that time. One was the fact that they didn't seem as though there was a lot of interest with regards to going further with steroids, and they had brought in another drug that we knew had no clear mortality benefit but reduced length of stay. By now, you should know what that drug is. And it got me really wondering what is going on here? Who are we trying to advocate for? Is it really for patients or is it for industry? So that was the first red flag. Now, just today, I've had a discussion with someone who had been reaching out to me for some time about a health related product that I cannot say. And it's not the one that rhymes with pectin. This is something else that I hadn't heard of before about 2022, maybe 2021 into 2022. Never heard of it before. And this product was being used all across Latin America, Central and South America, to the extent that one country actually put it through legislation as a potential therapy. It got completely suppressed in a way that I had never seen anything before. And there is a link in the description to the discussion I had about it. It is so suppressed that I cannot say the name of it. When I did a presentation in 2022, curiously, just talking with a few experts about their experience, within hours, my videos were removed and I was banned. So I knew at that time something was wrong. But the premise remains that even though I'd been burnt badly, I still thought I had to come back to just reflecting a bit more on the science, what it was. And so I had a discussion. If you're interested, use the link in the description to go to my Substack. You'll be able to see it there. It's not too long and we don't go into too much depth. We just talk generally about it and what may be beneficial. But I still can't say what it is. That's how bad the suppression is. So it got me to thinking, really, what is going on here? Are they really interested in your health? Do they want you to be well? Really? And I had to ask that question because it is so strange what is going on. So after I did the discussion, I was then doing an exercise of reflecting, what would happen if this was something else? Okay, how would it be treated? What have the lessons shown us over the past 5 years? So I thought about a drug that we use commonly, aspirin. And I thought to myself, well, actually, aspirin could have been beneficial in COVID, but the doses I think would have been too high for us to use. We wouldn't have used it because um, I think it would have easily required maybe about 1200 milligrams a day. It would have probably been effective, but at a high risk of stomach irritation and bleeds and so on. And so it was never really used, even though there was quite a bit of research around the benefit of bringing in even small doses. But that's a different question. But I then thought, What would happen if baby aspirin, the one that is sold over the counter, 75 milligrams, or depending on where you are, 81 milligrams, um, what would happen if that was shown to have been really remarkable at suppressing deaths if it was used early? And I put my conversation and my thoughts into artificial intelligence, and I said, look at this and tell me what you think. And it was fascinating. It just spat out exactly what were the conflicts, why it was that early treatment, and I have to be even careful about saying this because early treatment was a dirty word. There was no treatment. The only thing you could hope for was hospital treatment and, in time, a vaccine. Nothing else. You didn't want to look at anything else. That is all that mattered. And so when you reflect on it, me as a scientist and me from a clinical point of view, I believe that you leverage everything you've got. It's a pandemic. You use every resource from every angle. If people are going to die anyway, definitely try. Don't just don't do anything. That's terrible. So, in my view, if you are in a situation where you have limited options, it's like being in the battlefield. You don't have access to surgery. The person's leg is partially shot off. They're bleeding to death. You don't have a sterile field. Do you just use a tourniquet and do the surgery right there? Someone would say, no, you don't, because it's not sterile. Well, the person is going to die if you don't do anything. That's how it felt to me in the pandemic. But, for other people, it may have been different. And so this is why I didn't understand. So I'm going to take you through the exercise as to what was said when I put it to artificial intelligence. It then took me step by step based on the trajectory as to what happened with other drugs and with this unspoken therapy, it told me what would have been the playbook if aspirin had been shown to be effective. So let me take you through it. And remember, this is purely hypothetical. So I am just sharing with you exactly what it said in terms of how it thinks the regulatory agencies and government agencies would have behaved if instead of some of the other things it was aspirin. So the first thing that would have happened is this. Imagine that, as we said in early 2020, the doctors observed that, the clotting, the thrombosis, the microvascular damage, they found that aspirin could reduce mortality by preventing blood clots. So that's the first stage. So you just have to imagine that's what had happened is that, you know, 75 milligrams of aspirin, people were using it and they were finding, oh my goodness, patients aren't dying. Wow, isn't that incredible? You would think so, wouldn't you? So what it then said is that you would then see independent doctors start recommending daily aspirin for high risk patients because if it could prevent severe disease and we knew who was high risk, you just say, listen, let's put them on aspirin. And again, let me remind you, this is hypothetical because at the moment, aspirin, baby aspirin, while it may have some benefit, it's not a therapy for severe COVID. But follow along with this narrative. What we would expect in a rational system is then widespread studies would be encouraged. But what AI said is given past responses, the discovery might have been dismissed or even actively suppressed. And this is not me. This this is artificial intelligence based on our trajectory, giving an honest and open reply to what it thought based on what we did before. This is what we would have done with aspirin. So immediately after Imagine doctors finding a benefit, it could have been actively suppressed. Then, what is phase two? What would have happened next? So, AI then says by mid 2020, even though there was promising data, and just in case you're just entering, remember this is hypothetical. Not saying aspirin is an early treatment for COVID. I'm just saying, imagine if it was. It's an imaginary scenario that I worked through with artificial intelligence. So let's continue. So, what they would have then said, the major health agencies would question the validity of the aspirin studies. They would say, no, 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 there is no large scale randomized trials. They would raise the risk, reasonable risk of gastric bleeding. And then they would talk about all this misinformation about aspirin being beneficial and people are medicating, and then the public would be taking aspirin. And, what an awful situation, and that would have been the focus. Remarkably, there would have been less interest, it seems, in the fact that it could have saved lives. And again, it raises the point, as I said, do they really want you to be well? And sadly, and I'm not talking about doctors here, I am talking about the system. It's very important to note that for doctors, doctors are hamstrung by protocols. They can't go outside of protocols. So if there's no protocol that involves something, they can't use it, they can't prescribe it. They could get delicensed, as you can see, for using anything off label. It's not that they can't use off label drugs, but it comes at high risk. And so it's not actually doctors that are the problem here, it is the system, because the doctors get the instructions from the experts. And sadly, in some situations, the experts are influenced by industry and finance. And so, therefore, if they are influenced, it means the whole system becomes influenced. That's really a weak spot that we have to go back to as healthcare advocates. We really need to go back and see where those risk strategies need to be mitigated. As we go on, then what would have happened, it says, is media outlets would begin negative campaigns with headlines. Aspirin not proven to treat COVID 19. Experts warn of dangerous bleeding risks. Then you would have PTV doctors, fact checkers saying it's unproven, risky, and harmful when used for COVID 19. And that would have been in the early part of the pandemic because, as I said, that is exactly what happened. That was the playbook. Remember, one of the drugs in question is probably, in the past, was probably safer than paracetamol. And yet, it was absolutely suppressed. I mean, at the time, I didn't look at the research and specifically on it. I was very neutral on it. But when I heard people talking about this thing that rhymed with pectin, I thought, well, what have you got to lose? There are almost no side effects with it. And then suddenly it blew up, and I was thinking, that makes no sense. This thing we use it all the time. I mean, they use it at population level. So why would anybody be concerned? But as I'm saying, the discussion I had, and you have to look in the link in Substack, there's potentially something else that could have done even better, which is absolutely remarkable. But let's continue along with regards to this hypothetical situation. So then what AI said is then you would have big tech censorship starting. So then, if aspirin had been being promoted, then social media platforms would deplatform doctors for talking about aspirin, labeling it as medical misinformation. Then all of the big tech platforms would suppress any post talking about potentially benefits with it, even though this is an over the counter drug. And the expectation, it would have been open scientific debate. But in reality, based on past trajectory and what has been seen and done, the reality is that the narrative would be controlled and any dissent would have been silenced. That is so accurate. I mean, it's remarkable that, truthfully, AI is giving us a mirror image as to how things were done and how the system behaved. It's remarkable. It really does reflect what is the reality as opposed to what should be the reality. Let's move along. So then what it says would have then happened is a regulatory crackdown on aspirin. I mean, it sounds almost silly, but this is what, based on past history, this is what they would have done. You would then have warnings that there is no evidence that aspirin treats it. Self medicating could be dangerous. Then it is officially not recommended in any protocol, meaning that it is not to be used. Any doctor who prescribed it would face threats. Any physicians using it would risk losing their medical licenses. Any trials investigating it would face funding obstacles. I mean, that is so accurate. Again, I remind you, this is hypothetical. I am just saying that I use the discussion using aspirin, baby aspirin, over the counter aspirin that people use all the time, and what would happen to it if this was actually shown to potentially have been beneficial based on the trajectory as to what we had done before. And as a reminder, if you're just joining me, this is in relation to a health product that I can't name that I had a discussion with about on my Substack that apparently they thought all through South and Central America was tremendously beneficial. They were using it all the time and they got absolutely shut down to the point that I cannot say the name for the risk of censorship. That is how bad it is. Continuing along. What they then would have done, based again on what they did before, is that pharmacies would restrict the sales of over the counter aspirin because of the risk of panic buying. Some countries would even consider making baby aspirin prescription only to prevent misuse. It was saying that the expectation would have been that aspirin in this kind of scenario should be studied and, if effective, widely recommended. But in reality, it would be restricted, ridiculed, and labeled as dangerous. And if you don't believe me, remember what happened as well with regards to vitamin D. I mean, at the time, from a scientific point of view, could not believe. Now, forget about whether or not it had any benefit in the COVID-19. Just for a moment, forget that argument. If somebody is vitamin D deficient, you would want to know and you would want to treat them. Simple. Nothing else. There is no other argument. There's no other discussion. Forget about COVID. If you screened your population and found that 86% were vitamin D deficient, which is what it is in many of the temperate countries, you would want to treat it. Instead, I couldn't believe when I heard people seriously saying there is no evidence that it's beneficial and people shouldn't take it. And I said, people are deficient. Just give them vitamin D. Forget about COVID. Just treat the vitamin D deficiency. What they didn't realize was the impact it could have on immunity and the risk of immune responses because they didn't understand the autoimmune component of COVID 19. And so maybe they just didn't know. Maybe it's just the fact that, if they had better understanding of the science, they would have been less likely to be jumping up and down about things that really they shouldn't have been focused on. Anyway, moving along. What else did it say? What would then have happened? Alternative and expensive drugs would have been pushed instead. So by the winter, they would have said that companies would have developed patented blood thinners, literally the replica of aspirin, and critically, they would have cost 50 to 100 times more than aspirin and generate billions in revenue. So the expensive alternatives would be promoted instead of aspirin. Now, you may think that's far fetched, but let me tell you, after the investigation that I did, and I looked at it objectively from the start, when I reflect on what was done in the context of how remdesivir was used, I am ashamed. It's not that the drug had no benefit, it's an antiviral. But I did a whole presentation. Again, that's in Substack. I didn't think I could put the full thing up on mainstream because it is so pointed at the fact that that was primarily gearing financial rewards. And it was terrible. I felt sick after I did it. I thought, I cannot believe that this was done. And it wasn't because of the drug per se. The thing that got me sick was that in the USA, 20% of hospitals chose not to use dexamethasone and use remdesivir instead. That, I mean, it had no mortality benefit, remdesivir, and it did have an impact in terms of length of stay, but for that to have been done, I mean, when you look at the numbers, and you have to look at that presentation in the Substack as well, when you look at the numbers and you realize how much money was made because of that and how many lives potentially were lost, it's terrible. As I said, you have to actually look at the details to understand just how bad it was. The final point that was made in terms of AI was this: after a few years, after everything that needed to have been done was done, and the money that was made, you would find a retrospective admission of benefit. So then they would go, oh, well, actually, there was probably some benefit all along. Then there'd be some quiet publication of articles saying, actually, it may have helped, you know, but there would be no accountability for those who suppressed it and those who suffered due to lack of early treatment. Just before, just in case you're joining me, I did not write that. That is what was the outcome from AI when analyzing what we did in the past. The beauty about AI is that it's honest. So even when they try and put in systems to make it say answers that they want it to say, once you put the facts in front of it, it gives you an honest answer. And this, everything I've shown you so far, is exactly what it put down. Look at it again. This is the final point it made. It said there would be retrospective admission of benefit. There would be no accountability for those who suppressed the benefit, and there would be no compensation for those who suffered due to the lack of early treatment. The expectation should have been that if there was an effective treatment, it should have been embraced to save lives. The reality, an honest reality, is that profits, politics, and centralized control override patient health. Remember, I did not come up with that. That's not my idea. That is the honest, frank, true, clear, to the point assessment of what we did in the pandemic from the perspective of artificial intelligence. That's what history is going to say. What it's saying now is what anybody objectively 30 years down the line is going to say. Let me repeat it. Here is what they said. In reality, profits, politics, and centralized control override patient health. Think about it. You have to make a choice. And the reality is that, for while I have a voice, I can say these things. But if you, the public, put up with this kind of thing, expect that it's going to get worse because you are clearly not at the moment the priority. And if you don't realize that by now, in time you will learn that. That is as far as I can see. And I'm going to show you again the final slide that was produced and an objective assessment of the pandemic based on artificial intelligence looking at what we did with potential early treatments, it said, in reality, profits, politics, and centralized control override patient health. I can't see anything that's more accurate than that. We've got to find a way to make things better. One thing is for certain, if you leave the people who did that to you in the first place in power, they will do it again. Have a great evening.